Okay, so I'm Kelly Smith. I wear several hats at the Drought Center. I'm the Assistant Director and the Communications Coordinator, but my research is on drought impacts and how we can use drought impacts data in drought planning. So that's the part I will be focusing on today. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Drought Center before I introduce my colleagues who will be speaking. The Drought Center up on the 8th floor of Hardin Hall is probably best known for its role in producing the U.S. Drought Monitor map each week, but we're actually much more than our most visible product. So Don Wilhite founded the center in 1995, and our center's mission was literally drought mitigation in the sense of helping people reduce their vulnerability to drought. We are really fundamentally about drought planning. But this question about how we know where drought is and how bad it is just proved to be scientifically irresistible. So scientists started talking to one another, one thing led to another, and the US Drought Monitor map was born. And it quickly took on a life of its own. It comes out every Thursday, and it's really helped focus attention on drought. And that attention stemming from that weekly map is really one of the drivers of our Drought Center's growth over the years. In addition to climatologists, we now employ social scientists, planners, IT and GIS people, communicators, and more. And this diversity of disciplines helps us go beyond telling people where drought is and how bad it is to helping them actually be prepared. Our original mission is still in effect, helping people plan ahead to protect their lives and livelihoods from drought. And those of us here today are going to provide some highlights about how we're doing that. Tonya Haigh leads the Drought Center's social science area, and many of you may have collaborated with her before now on surveys of farmers and ranchers and how they make drought-related decisions. Cody Knutson leads the Drought Center's work with planners. He lives and works out of South Dakota, but he's part of the Drought Center. He actually enjoys reading drought plans and then advises states, tribes, and governments around the world on how to write drought plans. Bathke leads the NDMC's education and outreach efforts. She is a U.S. Drought Monitor author, one of the people who makes the map each week, and is also very good at helping people understand drought science and how to use it in planning. So she will tell us about some of the scenario exercises she leads. And now I will seamlessly turn this over to Tonya.
Okay, so I'm going to lead off. Thanks, Kelly. Again, so I'm Tonya Haigh. I'm the social science coordinator. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, it's nice to meet you all. I'm going to be talking about one of the human dimensions of drought, which is decision making. And specifically, I'm going to talk about making drought science more useful for decision making and management. And this kind of goes back to what Kelly was saying. Like, the Drought Center really is kind of known for the Drought Monitor right now, right? But the Drought Monitor itself doesn't just magically help us manage our impacts. We have to take that information like the Drought Monitor and other information and figure out how to incorporate it into our decision making and reduce the kinds of impacts that Kelly's going to be talking about in her talk. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what do we know about what makes drought science usable and actionable for natural resources decision making. Because we know we can't just place it in front of somebody. Presenting information to somebody doesn't mean that they have any idea how to use it to start with, that they trust it, that it's relevant for the decisions that they're actually making, that they have any capacity to really do anything with it that's really going to make a difference. So understanding that process of drought decision making is one of the key things we need to understand in order to provide the right information and help it fit into decisions to actually help communities and individuals mitigate and adapt to drought. So I'm going to organize the examples of some of the research that the NDMC is doing. I'm going to organize that around this, this schematic related to how people and organizations make decisions. And this comes from a paper, I guess you can see the citation here, a paper led by Amanda Cravens that puts this typology together, and it's really organized under how is the drought problem framed, and you can see a number of different aspects of that. Who are the people making decisions, and then what are the different characteristics of those people? What are the actual decisions or the actions that can be taken either before or in response to drought? And then what are the, those interactions among people, among decisions, among problem framing, that really make decision making so interesting and complex and all of that. So I'm going to talk about just a few of these and then talk about some of the research that the NDMC has been doing. And if I keep my brain together, I'm going to call out some of the grad students and staff who've been really important in doing some of this research. So I'm going to start a little backwards, and I'm going to start with the decisions and the actions that are taken in response to drought. And if we don't really understand these decisions, what are the decisions, then it's really hard for us to actually figure out how to inform those decisions. So it sounds like a really simple question, but it's surprisingly complex. The NDMC has worked with a number of different sectors to identify decisions that need to be made and also the critical timing of decisions. And one of the ways that we've done that is through developing something called decision calendars. A decision calendar is simply, it can be cyclical on an annual basis. It's kind of a map of where and when management decisions need to be made, and how drought might be actually affecting those decisions. And it's something that the process of actually sitting down with stakeholders and co-creating a decision calendar together can really help get information providers or any scientists, any science providers, and end users of that information on the same page about how the information can and maybe should be used. So we've worked with decision makers in a lot of different sectors, but my examples are mostly coming out of agriculture. The real fancy cyclical graphic that you can see is an annual decision calendar for Midwest apple production that we were able to work with the Midwest Climate Hub to do some of that work. The document that you can see behind it that just looks like dates and text is actually an annual decision-making calendar for a rancher in south central Kansas. So a decision calendar can look a number of different ways. That's not what's really important. What's really important is kind of honing in on what are those key decisions, when they need to be made, what information we need to know to make those decisions. And one of the things we found, especially with ranchers, if that image weren't so blurry, you could actually see what the ranchers' decisions were, and you'll see that they're very well defined. And one thing that we found is the more well-defined ranchers in particular, but probably anybody's decisions are, the more they actually find climate and drought information to be influential to the decision and influential to their decision-making, because they've got a very specific use of it. So any work that we do to help identify and make those decisions specific can help us better link drought science and drought information with those decisions. So I'm going to move on to who makes decisions about drought. So I've been talking a lot about farmers and ranchers, but who else might we want to actually be using drought science in decision making? And obviously, so there's a lot of different types and characteristics of decision makers who need to make decisions to manage drought and avoid impacts. Some of the work that we have done is exploring differences in decision making on grazing lands that are privately managed versus publicly managed. Very different processes, different people come into play. This is some work that our social science staff, Maddie Gable's been involved in. We've also done some work in the past more at the landscape level of looking really at the intersecting and really complex layers of decision makers and agencies and policies that are in effect, controlling the decision space around drought on land. And so the other image is Montana, and each of the different colors and symbols is a different decision-making body. So it can get very complex. I bring up the Montana because the NDMC is actually working on a new project in Montana where we are working with ecological land managers. And some of you may have met Charity Grummert, who's a new graduate student who's working with us on that. So. Then third, this question of how is the problem framed. This seems maybe not quite as straightforward as the other two questions. I want to give a couple of examples. from some recent research, and again, call out some of our folks who've been working on this. So a couple ways to, here's one example of how is a problem framed. We've done some work with ranchers. We got ranchers together at a workshop with drought tool providers at a workshop, and we learned a lot about how people maybe framed drought differently. So some people think about drought as something that I need to think about just when precipitation is scarce. If precipitation is not scarce, not a problem. Some ranchers really think about drought as part of their complete overall operation. It's something that's part of their overall management. And so the way that they, the decisions that they're making and their information needs are very different from somebody who's thinking about drought just in years when precipitation may be scarce. So that's one, and this was a workshop, I want to say, that Maddie as well as Grace Campbell had a big role in, and really appreciate that. So that's one example that may or may not make the most sense. Another example is when drought occurs, what's the problem? Is the problem, some people have a very singular problem. We might, again, if we're talking about ranchers, is the problem just, I need this much forage for my animals? Or are you somebody who's managing on maybe for broader outcomes where you might be looking at that same piece of land and you're thinking more about forage, or you might be thinking about grasses for habitat, you might be thinking about water availability, you might be thinking about overall ecological conditions. So those types of things really frame how we think about the problem, which really affects how the information we need and how we're making decisions about drought. So hopefully those give a little bit better examples. And down here, I want to say Maddie and Leah Campbell recently were able to go to the Society for Range Management and do a really neat experiment on problem framing that we're hoping will help us improve our communication in communicating drought monitoring. So hopefully I haven't gone over my time, but I want to wrap up and say that this is a really quick summary of the social science, some of the social science work going on at the Drought Center. There's this fourth area that, this interactions that I just want to call out because I think when Deb's talking about scenarios, some of that is going to, you're going to think like, oh yeah, that's all about interactions. And I'm going to turn it now over to Cody. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Cody.
All right, thank you, Tonya. And if you or Kelly, one of you could advance my slides, that would be great.
Got it.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to expand on what Tonya just talked a little bit about in terms of how to take some of that social science information and apply it to planning, the topic of planning. Now, when I'm talking about drought planning, I'm talking about efforts, activities, processes that focus on really understanding the problems associated with a lack of precipitation, and using that information to identify actions that can be ideally taken before and during a drought event to reduce the likelihood of experiencing drought impacts the next time it comes along. And when you hear about drought planning, you might hear about drought response and drought mitigation. In the past, if a lot of entities had a drought plan, it would more than likely be a response plan, in that it would lay out who would do what during a drought event. It was more of a reactionary plan. And more over the years, people are paying more attention to what can you do ahead of drought to put your place, your sector, your activity of interest in the best shape possible, so that you're more resilient and better able to withstand the impacts of drought. And in this case, we refer to that as mitigation. So a lot of the newer plans will be more drought mitigation and response plans. And next slide, please. And this is illustrated as an example by the development of plans at the state level in the United States. Now, back in 1982, down in your bottom left, there were only 3 states that had a drought plan, and those were drought response plans. It had some actions of who would do what during the next drought event. But because of especially severe droughts in the late 1980s, that led to the rapid creation of more plans as one of the reasons. But still, those are still drought response plans. And that also led to the ultimate creation of the National Drought Mitigation Center. So with the creation of these centers, like the NDMC, like NOAA's Drought Office, we began to advocate for drought mitigation and response planning, along with fields like hazard planning in general for flood planning. And all of them are talking about drought mitigation. What can you do in advance of drought? And so you'll see by 2006 that there's getting to be, the colors in the orange are the states that have drought mitigation and response plans. And the states in green are the ones that have the drought response plans. And you'll see the ones in blue or purple are the ones that are either in development or deferred to local municipalities, for example, or counties for planning. But by 2023, now the colors on our map changed, but if you see a state that's colored in green, and the darker the green color, the newer the plan. Those are drought mitigation and response plans, and the ones in blue are the response plans. And so there's two things going on. One, more states are developing drought plans. You can see almost all of them, 46 states have a drought plan now, and 17 of those states have a drought mitigation and response plan. Now, all of these plans are different. I don't know that there's two that are the same because each place is different, their needs are different, and their preferences are different in how they want to go about it. You can go to the next slide. That's great. And so they're all different, but we say, okay, if you're developing a drought mitigation and response plan, what should go in them? And we say at the minimum, you should integrate the 3 pillars of drought risk management that we call them. One, you should have a drought early warning system. So you should have a way to monitor and track drought conditions. And that would be precipitation, snowpack, reservoir levels, all of those physical indicators and related impacts that can denote drought conditions on an ongoing basis. But as the drought starts to intensify, as you start seeing those deficits in the precipitation and other hydroclimatic indicators, you need a way to communicate that to people. And as it becomes especially severe and you're entering into that drought situation, you need to know when to trigger actions. And that's part of your drought early warning system: monitoring, communication, and triggering actions. You should also undertake a vulnerability assessment, like we talked about in the earlier slide, to understand who and what is at risk from drought and why. What are you interested in? What are the threats from drought to your sector or area of interest that you're planning for? And then you can, if you have a good understanding of the effects of drought and maybe why they occur, how they're related to these deficits in your indicators, then you can use that information to identify hopefully effective and timely drought mitigation and response actions. And hopefully all of this is done before you get into a drought situation. When you're not in drought is the best time to plan. So you can have all these things well thought out in advance of drought, and you're not having to do it through a very hectic and stressful time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and that's where a drought planning process comes in. And the process is really about bringing together the right people with the right understandings to help pull all of these different pieces together in an organized fashion to develop this complete drought mitigation and response plan. How to put these people together into a plan moving forward. Okay, next slide. Okay, now earlier I mentioned planning being done at the state level, and Tonya mentioned at the ranching level, for example. But there's planning going on at all states or all scales, and increasingly so. More people are involved in planning. It could be from the individual farmer and rancher. It could be communities. We do a lot of work with tribes and states, regional basins, or nations. We have the opportunity to work with a lot of different nations around the world on drought planning. Okay, next slide. Now, what is our role at the NDMC in this, in planning? And I think we can probably lump a lot of our activities into 3 categories. One is drought planning research. Another one is planning guidance development, developing a lot of those guides to help other people plan on their own, and then providing training and technical assistance related to drought planning. Next slide. For example, in terms of the research and the developing the drought guides, as Tonya mentioned, there's a lot of research that's gone on since the NDMC was first developed or established in 1995. So there's focus groups, interviews, workshops, surveys, really to go out and talk to people about their needs in terms of drought and planning, in terms of what strategies they're thinking about or have tried, how they would approach planning, what they would like to see in some guidance. All of that information, we take that information and we apply it to specific groups in a lot of cases. For example, in the center, there's a Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch website and guide that we've developed with through a lot of interaction with producers. Down on the bottom right, the Planner's Guide to Drought and Cascading Impacts. That was work we did with the American Planning Association and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to develop some guidance for community planning. And down on the bottom left is a website we've been working on developing, still in development, that's aimed more towards updating some of our state and county level guidance. So there's getting to be a lot of resources for just about anybody who would like to undertake drought planning. And at the end, I show our website where you can find a lot of this information. Okay, next slide. And then so far, we've done research, we've talked to a lot of people, we've seen what people have produced in the past, we're developing drought planning guidance, and now we can take that information and take it out to people, to present it to them or actually work with them to develop a drought plan. And this could be we get a lot of requests to go out and maybe just present at a conference or a workshop, or some group is having their annual meeting and they want us to talk about drought and planning. We can do that. We can work with people to develop drought planning programs like the bottom left, working with Jerry Valesky in Extension, for example, to develop drought planning trainings for ranchers. We've done some of those as well as a lot with other groups. And then actually going out, like I mentioned, and working with people to produce plans. And that's I think all of this is the really fun part, getting to go out and working with people. For example, the bottom middle there, we worked with the state of Nebraska in developing their drought plan. Right next to that, the Mahasad Assad protected area in Saudi Arabia. That was a little bit interesting. We were able to work on a wildlife preserve. They had lost some animals during the recent drought. So we worked with them to develop a plan to protect those animals in the future. And the top right would be the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota. And finally, at the international level, the country of Jordan, their recent drought plan they created in 2022. So there's a wide variety of opportunities for planning out there. And like I said, more people are doing it. And our role in that, we don't necessarily write the plans. What we will do is provide information on how to get started, maybe some information on the process, the steps involved, and maybe facilitate some exercises and review plans and the planning process as they go along. Okay, next slide. And I think this is the last one. All of this information, so as I said, there's an increasing amount of resources available out there to help people at whatever scale you're working at in developing a drought plan. There's at the bottom left, this is our website, our planning page, where it has access to a lot of different drought plans. Because a lot of times that's the first thing people do is go look at other people's plans. So they don't have to start from scratch and they can see what others have done, as well as the drought mitigation database with examples of actions you can put into your plan. So like I said, a lot of resources out there. Come to our website, take a look at it, or just give us a call if you're interested in a drought planning project. All right, thank you.
So I'm going to talk some about drought impacts and planning and how we think about them. I tend to frame drought planning as a series of questions. And so for me, the really key question in drought planning is what or who do we want to protect from drought? Drought impacts point to underlying vulnerability, and it's that underlying vulnerability that you can address ahead of time to reduce how drought affects you. The images on this slide show several different examples of drought impacts collected across the United States. Hydropower production is reduced. Of course, a lot of cities ask people to reduce water use during drought. Typically, it's less outdoor use for lawn and landscape watering, and you try to preserve the core use for cooking and hygiene indoors. Of course, crops are damaged or lost. Wildlife habitat, fish mortality are affected by drought, and recreation, literally boat ramps and docks are left high and dry during drought. So how do we get a handle on this? In 2005, the Drought Center launched a tool called the Drought Impact Reporter to try to collect a comprehensive account of drought impacts across the country. This is powered by the tireless efforts of my colleague Denise Gutzmer, a climatologist who spends the bulk of her working time reading the results of an automated news search process and looking for evidence of a drought impact. And when she finds it, she logs it one at a time into the Drought Impact Reporter. Our definition of a drought impact for these purposes is a loss or change at a specific place and time due to drought. And one of the key purposes of the Drought Impact Reporter is to inform the drought monitor process, this weekly assessment of the location and severity of drought across the country. I ended up getting involved in the Drought Impact Reporter because it uses news as data. And I was coming from a communications background, writing news, basically. So it was a completely different slant on news, but I had a lot of ideas about how we could make best use of this. And part of what's baked into the Drought Impact Reporter is inferring information from news stories about the extent and duration of drought impacts and trying to map that scientifically. It is inherently qualitative data. And I would be happy to have a knockdown, drag-out argument with anyone who wants to tell me it's anecdotal, because it is systematically collected qualitative data. It's not one thing you overheard at a bar over some urban legend. This is actually, when you're scanning for information meaningfully across space and time, it's not anecdotal. But it's also not quantitative. I think we thought at first that dollars would be the units of drought impacts, but that is actually very difficult to come by, because first you have to quantify an impact and then figure out what dollar amount to multiply by. So we're really just at the stage of what impacts do we care about enough to collect the data to quantify. And as a kind of a result of that, so we've kind of got this proliferation of other tools built up around the Drought Impact Reporter. The Drought Impact Reporter is still the main one, and I'll highlight just a couple of the other ones. But we have this thing now called the Drought Impacts Toolkit that's more than one thing. One of the things we're working on is condition monitoring observer reports. Takes advantage of crowdsourcing technology to basically give anyone who wants a voice in the depiction of drought impact a chance to show pictures and provide descriptions of how drought is affecting their little spot of land. Everybody can have their dot on the map. You can upload photos, you can provide descriptions, and it may or may not contribute to a change in how the drought monitor depicts drought. And different states have opted to use this in different ways, which is why the map looks really, it's kind of uneven, the distribution of reports. We're building a system, and some states are basically building a very accountable, deliberate conversation around it, and others just say, send everything you got, just put your dot on the map. So it's really been an interesting process, and it's still very actively evolving. And I also want to give a shout out here to Ian Ratcliffe, who works at CalMet most of the time and partly for the Drought Center. And he's the one who's been building dashboards related to drought impacts. I really appreciate his efforts in getting things to display as nicely as they can. Another one of our efforts related to drought impacts is just to scrape Twitter and see, they call it social media listening. What is already being said? What can we learn? And the tweets that I'm showing here are ones that I consider particularly interesting or valuable. Blowing dust, fields before and after drought conditions, cracked earth, just real time, what does it look like here? And I would call this original content produced by agricultural producers or outdoor enthusiasts, other people like that. The truth is these really informative tweets are kind of hard to come by. There's just a lot of chatter. It's a pretty noisy process. So a next stage, I do this every Monday and make a map available to the Drought Monitor authors and anyone else who's paying attention, who wants to see what the drought chatter is that week. But a next stage of this research, given resources, would be to partner with computer science people or AI, people who know how to pick out images of landscapes and say, oh, help us figure out what the most substantially interesting ones are going to be. There is some really good quantitative drought impact data out there, and it doesn't happen by accident. In this case, some of the best data out there relates to claims filed, crop insurance claims due to drought. And the Drought Center is actually involved in a project with the US Department of Agriculture. Several of us are working on this, comparing the occurrence of drought with how often people file claims and the uptake on crop insurance. Are people buying enough insurance in the right places? Are there some places where they're always getting reimbursed for drought? Are there hot spots and cold spots of drought insurance? So this is a really interesting project, and this data, this excellent data, exists because people have the motivation to file an insurance claim to recoup their losses. In another case, it's harder to find this kind of information. This is a really interesting project that the state of California took on, documenting the location of dry domestic wells. Agricultural workers in the Central Valley of California live in underserved municipal areas that were never really meant to be permanent settlements, but they've lived there for decades. And their domestic wells, it's like a row of houses, and each house has its own well, and they go dry in drought, especially because the growers around them are draining groundwater at a faster rate during drought. So the state of California passed the human rights right to water as an act in the state legislature, and then the state is working with the Community Water Center and others to actually extend water mains to these different communities, and it's actually just a tremendously involved process. But a first step in that case was to collect the data about where the wells are going dry and the extent of the problem. So, first it comes to us qualitatively through news, through other accounts. Hey, wells are going dry, it's a problem. Then there's the data collection phase of actually documenting the extent of the problem. And then there's doing something about it. And I will add that on this vulnerability front, the Drought Center is working with the state of Oregon now. Several of us are involved in a project to do a drought vulnerability assessment for the state of Oregon. So, and that's an interesting opportunity to sort of pioneer some different uses of the available data. So this morning, this is a trigger warning. My next slide is a little bit disturbing. This morning, as I was sitting on the couch thinking about what I needed to say today, this headline literally came across my iPad, that Somalia's drought has caused 43,000 deaths. And my immediate reaction was to want to quibble about that. I mean, I also feel a little bit heartbroken about that, but I mean, the reality is drought doesn't cause deaths. War causes deaths, conflict, ill will, the complete breakdown of civil society. So if you want to prevent deaths due to drought, make sure everyone has access to clean and healthy drinking water. And that is, as we've seen with events in Flint and in Jackson, Mississippi, disasters happen in the United States too. Clean and healthy drinking water, enough food, access to health, access to education, the basic elements of civil society fundamentally are what we need to prevent drought impacts. So this always reminds me, this conversation about the drought impact data reminds me of that thing in a JFK speech about ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So I want to say, ask not where's the drought impact data, but who or what do we need to protect from drought? And then finally, what additional data do we need? But we may really, in a lot of cases, already know what we need to know to take action. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deb.
I find it really awkward after teaching for so many years to be standing beside or behind the screen and not drawing on my inner Vanna White and walking in front and pointing at things. So my name is Deborah Bathke. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the National Drought Mitigation Center. And today I'm going to be talking to you about just one way that our education and outreach team takes the research that Tonya discussed and Cody discussed and Kelly discussed, and how we bring that to communities. So how we use that decision-making research, how we use that drought planning research and that drought impact information to work with communities and to help them be engaged in the drought planning process, to help them actually take it, use it, come up with their own strategies to reduce their risks and their vulnerabilities to drought. Sorry, I'm kind of getting over a cold, so if I'm gasping for air, I'm really okay. It's just kind of in between that. So I'll be talking about a website that we developed at the center, and I think pretty much everyone at the center was involved with this at some point. I'd like to call out my partner in crime in the back, Tonya Burnett, if you want to raise your hand. She was very instrumental in working on this and helping write text and design things for this website. And it's called Collaborative Drought Planning Using Scenario Exercises. And this is the result of over a decade's worth of work from education and outreach on helping communities plan and prepare for drought and being involved in drought scenario-based exercises at some level, whether it's developing them, facilitating them, evaluating them, or all three. And so the website gives, we tried to make it as interactive as we could, and it provides information and tools to help plan, design, convene, evaluate, kind of the whole spectrum of these types of exercises. And I have the website listed up there, and I still keep trying to strain my neck even though it's right in front of me. So it's drought.unl.edu/scenario guide. So before we start talking about this, let's just take a minute and pretend that all of us in this room are a community. We're a community in rural Nebraska. What about our community makes us vulnerable or would make us vulnerable to drought? What are some things about a rural community in Nebraska? And you can pick your location. It can be, you know, the Panhandle or Southwest Nebraska or Northeast Nebraska. What would make us vulnerable about rural communities? And this is where I'm calling on you to make this interactive. And I'm going to pick on people I know if someone doesn't yell out an answer. So a dependence on agriculture. Usually they're highly dependent on agriculture or the environment in some ways. What else? Limited funds. Anyone here from a small town? What's the population of the small towns generally like? It's small. It's small, so you have limited funds, a limited tax base. It tends to be older. We hear a lot in Nebraska about the brain drain, how young people are moving out. What about the infrastructure? It's dated. I'm sorry? A single well, and oftentimes it's a shallow well as well. Say that 5 times fast. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I have. I don't know about where you all are from, but in my small town, well, maybe it's Nebraska as a whole, I don't know, there tends to be a resistance to change as well. That can be a strength or a weakness. Now, if we look at the flip side of that, rural communities also have many strengths. And I put this picture up for a reason, because this is one of my classmates from high school. This is his son in a powerlifting competition. And he was trying for 700 pounds in deadlift. So that's crazy. So I put that up there for strength because it's from my hometown as well. So what makes rural communities strong? We tend to focus on this is why they're vulnerable. Well, what strengths do they have? Say that again? Yes, definitely. They have these, they're close-knit. A lot of times you've got, when I go to a certain town in Iowa, I'm literally related to everyone in the town. Everybody, in some way, shape, or form. My mom came from a big family, and all of my grandma's sisters had big families, so I'm related to everybody there. Anything else? Or what does that lend itself to if you have this strong social networks? Yes, people look out for one another. You also have families that have been there for generations, and so you've got this multi-generational knowledge and informal support networks. What can you think of, Tonya? I'm getting really dry. I lost my water. No, I have some. As I disappear. Stop laughing at me, Tonya. What do we know about folks in rural communities? What else? They're pretty self-reliant, or they rely on their neighbors. And all of those are strengths that can be used to help reduce vulnerabilities. And what we do is we use these drought scenario exercises, which are just a way to engage communities and organizations in conversations related to planning for and responding to drought. They help these communities draw upon those strengths, those unique features that they have, and those can differ by communities, to address those weaknesses. And these exercises can take multiple forms. They can take the form of a workshop where we present a scenario, which is just a fictional drought. We found that if we use a fictional drought, then it gets them thinking and talking about it, as opposed to if we say, well, there was this bad drought in 2012, and folks will go, well, look at us now. It's 10 years later. We're fine. We made it through that. We can handle that. So we try to avoid using real dates and make things worse, make things longer, or just not tell them the date. They can take the form of a game, which is if you have a highly contentious basin, and we have a couple of those here in Nebraska, like the Republican maybe, where we can turn it into a friendly competition with teams, and they're competing against each other, but they're also learning from each other at the same time. Or we can do what's called a tabletop exercise, and if a location already has a plan, we can help them walk through that plan to see how it's going to work, to see if everything is up to date, to see if all the right people are involved. So there are a lot of different ways, and we talk about these on the website. We explain them in more detail. And we have this example, we have several examples, and this isn't up to date. I think it's going, the updates are maybe going live tomorrow or Friday, that talk about all of these different kinds of activities that we've done, whether it's a game, a workshop, or a tabletop exercise. And it's not just here in Nebraska. We've done them around the country. We've done some internationally. We've done them live. We've done them in person as well. And I have just a couple of pictures up from our recent events. And this first one in blue is from Alaska. And this was a game developed by Grace and Kaylee. I don't think Kaylee's in here, is she? Those two, so our graduate students, Grace and Kaylee, and then Tonya, Haigh, and I went to Alaska. And in Alaska, they're not very familiar with drought. It's not something that they've had to worry about a whole lot. And so part of the reason for this game was to get folks thinking about drought, thinking about the types of decisions that they make, when they make those decisions, and what they could do to respond to or prepare for or lessen those impacts of drought. So this was a really fun game. They had dice and they had a game board and they had money. We had NDMC bucks or something like that they had money to spend and they could earn. And if you notice, one thing common with these pictures is that people are smiling and laughing and they're talking, and you don't normally see that when you just give a talk. I mean, I don't see any of you out here like smiling and laughing and all excited about it and interacting with one another. And so that was part of our motivation for that. And then the one on the far side over there was one we did just 2 weeks ago in Alabama for the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint River Basin. So that's a highly contentious basis. They've had lots of lawsuits going on there. This is the first time they've had folks from all 3 states together talking since the Supreme Court decision came down on the water use in the basin. And so there we had folks kind of talking through the state plans. What does each state do, and how does that affect the other locations downstream from it? Communications was the main focus of this. So one of the activities we had them do is create their own newspaper front page, with Sharpies and a marker. And so there's their picture there. I think that's supposed to be a cow going in the heat. And part of the reason is so often, and anyone who gives interviews with the media knows this, that oftentimes they take like the one thing that you stumbled on or pick up or say wrong, and then that gets thrown out on the front page. And the states always complain that they only get the negative media coverage. So we had them create their own news story of what they would be doing during the drought. And so it had some really great outcomes, and people had a lot of fun, and they voted the next day to have us back again next year. So Grace, maybe you can come next year then. And that's all I have, just kind of a quick overview of that process. And here are our emails. Or you can always just pop up to the 8th floor and come see us. And I think we're supposed to have a Q&A for all of us now. So
as our speakers are making their way down, are there any questions here in the room? And for those of you online, start putting them in chat. I'll be checking that too. All right. Lots of questions. This is great.
Well, I guess I'm always negative perhaps first, and I guess I know that there'll come a time when we just won't get precipitation, perhaps, as the climate continues to warm. So even though areas have prepared, even though there's a great plan in place, what do you do when the drought just lasts and lasts and lasts? I mean, there will be extreme precipitation events probably that can interrupt the drought. So you help regions set up pools to receive that water so that it won't just run off. I mean, I don't know. So this is wonderful to help people get ready, but then what if it comes and really lasts a long, long time?
Yeah, Cody may have some comments on this. I think what you're talking about is, you know, it moving from actually being a drought to actually a ridification of an area that they're definitely facing in some regions, and when we start talking more about long-term adaptation to a new climate regime. And I don't know, Cody, is that something you want to comment more on?
Yeah, I could talk about that a little bit too. Yeah, you know, so in terms of planning, what you generally would do is come up with your drought mitigation component of what you're going to do ahead of time to get yourself in the best shape possible, you know, in terms of water storage and all of those, so you can withstand maybe a multi-year drought event. But then you also have that response plan to adjust and maneuver as the drought moves along. So if it gets into that, you know, and most people should be able to withstand a year or two of drought. If you've got those plans in place and all those strategies in place, you can move water, you can maybe purchase water, you can sell cattle, you can do a few of those things. But yeah, when you get into that severe multi-year event, like the Dust Bowl, for example, the 1930s drought, or in the Southwest right now, if you're getting into the 10 and 20 years, you're getting into a little bit more of a climatic shift, perhaps, or a long-term mega drought, people are calling those now. That's when you might have to really start thinking about that you need to change how you're doing things, or start investing in some of those major projects. So yes, they're probably, you know, most of the planning that I see are really tailored to those a few years of droughts. And then when you get beyond that, really might have to start making some of those dramatic changes.
Thank you. Here's our next question.
Hi, I'm Katya, and I'm a graduate student in SNR, and I'm doing, I'm actually planning some research focused on developing community exercises. I was really interested in the slides in the presentation on the scenario planning and the different group exercises. And I did want to ask if, because something I've heard from conservation professionals has been that as much as we give people facts, those often don't reach people to create internal change or community change. And like now they're encouraging people to do like art and like things that make people feel things or connect with their community to really get them to care. So I wanted to ask if you've seen how like, or if in these case studies you mentioned, there's discussions on like how these case studies impact like community connections as related to long-term drought planning.
The case studies that we have up there don't quite go into that level of detail, but I am happy to have more conversations with you on that. We did, one of the exercises that we did in, Tonya, was it Scottsbluff? Where we had the narratives. So it was using storytelling from different community members' point of view. So it was literally, Kelly, I overheard this in the grocery store. Someone was talking about, I can't remember what it was, but the stress that they're under because of the drought, or, you know, conversations about impacts that drought was having at the, like, after church service coffee, or a report from the food bank that came out that donations were down because of the drought, because people didn't have, or there were more visits because people who normally relied on their gardens for food in the summer didn't have that available to them. So we have done things where we've used more of a storytelling component like that, because, you know, for most people, it's one thing if you're doing a tabletop exercise and you're engaging the like state level folks in it who are used to looking at, you know, like Department of Natural Resources. They're used to looking at models and graphs and well data, versus if you're trying to have people from the schools that are there, or people from the media that are there, or local producers and things like that. If you're really wanting to draw upon their expertise, you need to take a different approach, so. And if that doesn't answer it, again, I'm up on the 8th floor, and I'm happy to talk a lot more about this with you, so, or Tonya, right over there, too. And thank you.
Just want to say thanks to the panel. Really good information. It's been very helpful. Getting back to the first question over there, I was thinking a lot of the same questions as you were presenting, but I was kind of, well, I heard on NPR this morning, they were talking to some people in California about how they had been praying for rain for years, and boy, did they get it. So I guess I'd just like some perspective from the panel on to what extent should we be including a very rapid, maybe even catastrophic end to multi-year drought, or just an interruption to drought in that manner in our planning process?
Yeah, they talk about cascading hazards as being particularly an increased risk in a changing climate, these flips from one extreme to another. And we had that in Nebraska too. I think it was 2019 to 2020 was a flood year to a drought year. So yes, yeah. And and sadly, it's not that unusual that drought ends in catastrophic flooding. So yes, we need to prepare for one extreme.
Yeah, and I could make one comment on that, in that, did I surprise you? In a lot of the plannings and the plans you'll see, they have a process for going into drought and stages going into drought. And oftentimes people forget to have a plan on how to come out. And so it's nice if you can think through that ahead of time. So when do we call off the drought? How fast do we do it? Do we stay in a little longer, to be cautiously optimistic? Or if you get a sudden increase in precipitation, like in California, at what level do we call off the declaration? Because there is a lag time. If you get a little precipitation, your crops might be fine, but your reservoirs are still low. And so it's going to take a little longer. There's some lag time in the system. So it really helps to think through that. And so you'll see in the planning, the current planning, people starting to think about that a little more and more.
Well, and in cases where you have a lot of rain in a short amount of time, a lot of that will run off and not necessarily be effective in reducing the drought. And so or the instance that we're seeing in the Midwest and the Northern Plains this year is there's so much snowpack and it fell on frozen ground. So we don't know yet what that effect will be. They're buried in snow, but will we have warm, windy days and it'll sublimate and go to the East Coast? Will we have rapid melt and it'll run off and end up, well, it'll probably flood here. So we don't know if it's actually going to be effective yet. But this question has come up a lot in the discussions that we have with stakeholders as well. And it's something that we have started to address in our scenario exercises too. And sometimes it could be a flood. Sometimes in one exercise, it was like, I think there was one where it was vandals broke in and they released the gates on the reservoir, and it drained the reservoir. Or we had in our exercise in Cambridge, Nebraska, some kind of fungus that came from Colorado or something. And we were blaming other states, whether it's Colorado or Kansas, and the only way to treat it was to flood your fields and not grow crops for a year. And so do you use up all your allocation for that? Or, so these are things that we're addressing in the scenarios as well. So, and trying to make them in not realistic to some extent, but to also make them in a way that will get people kind of thinking outside the box as well, because a lot of people don't like change.
On your case studies, is that what you called a multi-hazard tournament?
Yeah, the multi-hazard tournament, that one addressed flooding, drought, and water quality, and then some climate change things as well, too. So it's really what the scenario looks like is in part determined by what that group wants to focus on. You know, so if they want to address water quality, we'll have instances where drought causes either water quality issues for like wildlife habitats and things like that, or it starts to affect wells because well water's low and so you have an increased concentration of nitrates. And in Iowa, they were trying to determine, you can help me out here if you remember it, do we want to invest the millions or billions of dollars in infrastructure to build a new water treatment plant to address some of these water quality issues if we're going to be seeing them more and more in the future? Wasn't that what it was? Something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
Other questions for our panel? All right, well, one more, and then this will be our last question.
Thank you, super interesting. So my question relates to question number 2. You had very interesting workshops in Alaska and other areas that you mentioned had experienced droughts in the past, and you know it's been already a long period of time without a drought. So how do you go about convening people to those workshops? How do you make people interested in think through the problems like that?
That is such a good question. I can start, everybody, if I have something to say. Definitely, it is much harder to get people to a workshop when there hasn't recently been a drought, even though what's the best time to address drought? When drought's not happening. Yeah, usually it floods when we're trying to talk about drought. So when we were actually doing the decision calendar work with specialty crop growers in the Midwest, we just reframed the whole focus groups to be around flooding and drought, or too wet and too dry, because at the time, like, they were like, when is it ever dry? Well, since then it's been quite dry. So, you know, it happens, and that is kind of the catch-22 too, is then when everybody wants to have a workshop, is like in 2012, I think we had, request after request after request, and it's like, okay, but like we can talk about it right now, and if you can you can start thinking about the next drought, but there's not that much we can do about this drought right now. So yeah, definitely a challenge.
And we're certainly not going to play a game in 2012 when people's livelihoods are at stake. So it's not, you know, you don't want people to think you're playing a game with their livelihood. But in the case of Alaska, and I've done, I don't know, like 3 or 4 workshops there now, we had to reframe it as more rain, less snow. Because the word drought didn't mean anything to them. And if you were looking for drought impacts, if you search drought impacts, that phrase, you might get a sports team, like a high school sports team, like losing streak or something like that. And so we had to get creative with how we think about it and how you frame that problem. So a lot of it was warmer temperatures, more rain, less snow, you know, decreased snow or like ski resorts close, or, you know, different things like that. So you had to, or the lack of winter recreation activities are reduced, you know. So if it's cold and it's dark and then you don't have winter recreation on top of it, then yeah.
And on a super practical note, we always work with a local host, so it's not just us from national to local level.
Good point.
Any last
Well,
comments,
kind of
Cody?
adding on to that, Kelly, a final thought too, is that, most of, for example, the drought planning and the work, it comes during or right after a drought event, because one of the other questions came about the feeling or experiencing something to make you address it. They just went through a drought. They know they experienced it. They felt its effect and they want to do something about it. Like you said, though, it's a little more difficult to keep that momentum going. One, unless you put it in your plan that they will meet on a regular ongoing basis to evaluate progress on implementing a plan. And then 2, a lot of work has been done by a champion, finding somebody who just keeps hammering that topic of drought even during the non-drought years. Even in one of the guides we developed for the Middle East, the first step was to create a champion or identify a champion who will push this cause the locals with the locals for you. So you have a few things can work, I think.
All right, with that, let's thank our panel again.